Hi, everybody. Welcome to Christian Homestead. My name is Jared. I was poking around BYU speeches earlier today, and I came across this talk by Elder Bruce R. McConkie from January 8th, 1974, called Succession in the Presidency. And I thought this was pretty timely because in this upcoming General Conference, we're going to sustain President Oaks as president of the church. He was ordained back in October, but we're going to sustain him as a church in this next General Conference. And I'm really happy that I came across this because it is full of gems. Everything from, I think, little known details as to what the transition looks like when the apostles gathered together after the death of the previous prophet, to a new account of a visitation that I had no idea about. And it's kind of an important one. You can see up here at the top right, I have these 5 tabs. Each one is a spreadsheet that now has a quote from this talk. So I was pretty happy about this. Before we get into the talk, really quick, in case you had already subscribed, or even if you haven't, I've now set up my new channel called Jewish Scroll. It is focused on learning as much as I can about Judaism. It's the same format as Christian Homestead. So the link is in the description box below. You can also find it on my Christian Homestead homepage. Just go down to featured channels, and it starts with, all the brethren and their channels. Click on View All. You have to click on that. Click on View All, and then scroll down, and you have my Explore Church Sites channel and this new channel called Jewish Scroll, along with all the different Second Coming channels that I support and that I'm friends with. So make sure to subscribe to them as well. All right, so without further ado, let's get into this. Elder Bruce R. McConkie says, "Let us begin with the sure and certain conviction in our souls that this is the Lord's work. This is the Lord's church, and He is running it. There isn't any question at all about that. As President Oaks indicated," I was like, what, President Oaks? And I was like, oh yeah, this is a BYU speech. And at this time, in 1974, he was President Oaks, president of BYU. He was president from 1971 to 1980. And now, in 2026, this talk applies to him. Sorry, it was very unlikely that I was going to come across this talk today. I was just randomly looking around BYU speeches, and I came across this, and it's Elder Bruce R. McConkie talking about succession, and he mentions President Oaks at the beginning. I just want to remind you that when he was president of BYU, that's when they put together that time capsule, a 50-year time capsule, and they opened it 2 days after he was ordained president of the church. Now, I can't speak for President Oaks, but if it was me, I would take that as a sign. I would take that as an assurance that the Lord has a plan for my life. I was meant to be the president of BYU back then, and I was meant to be president of the church now. So, as we read this talk, he's going to be talking a lot about President Harold B. Lee because he's the one that had passed away and why he was giving this talk. But let's imagine that he's talking about President Oaks. So Harold B. Lee, we would equate him to President Nelson because President Nelson is the one that recently passed away. And then the incoming president was President Spencer W. Kimball. So let's associate President Kimball in this talk to President Oaks. It's interesting also to note that it was President Kimball that called President Nelson and President Oaks to the apostleship. All sorts of interesting connections here. Okay, so as President Oaks indicated, the Lord calls his prophets and the Lord releases his prophets. No prophet can be called by any other power, and no prophet can be released by any other power. And so, for reasons that are not wholly and completely known to us, although we do have some vision and understanding of what is involved. On Wednesday, December 26th, 1973, the Lord reached forth his hand and touched his servant, President Harold B. Lee. President Lee had been in good health. He had been vigorous and active up to that point in his life. But on that day, the Lord said to him, "Come hither, I have other work for you to do in another sphere. I have greater labors and a greater work for you here than you've been doing in mortality." I want to point out, let's go to this Wikipedia article that has a list of all the different presidents of the church. And as far as prophets go, he served for a relatively short time, only 1 year and 5 months. I think the only other prophet who served for less time was Howard W. Hunter. He served for 9 months, so not even a full year. He was 87 years old, but President Harold B. Lee was 74. So, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, it seems like he probably had some more life to him, but I think that Elder Bruce R. McConkie is correct that he was called home for a reason. He's going to talk more about that in just a second. Difficult as it is for us to envision fully why President Lee was taken, we have no difficulty in accepting it and in understanding that he's going forward in the Lord's work in another sphere. I would like to read a statement by President Wilford Woodruff relative to the passing of the noble and good and faithful from this life into the labors that await them in the realms ahead. President Woodruff says, "The same priesthood exists on the other side of the veil. Every man who is faithful in his quorum here will join his quorum there. When a man dies and his body is laid in the tomb, he does not lose his position. The prophet Joseph Smith held the keys of this dispensation on this side of the veil, and he will hold them throughout the countless ages of eternity. He went into the spirit world to unlock the prison doors and to preach the gospel to millions of spirits who are in darkness, and every apostle, every 70, every elder, etc., who has died in the faith as soon as he passes to the other side of the veil, enters into the work of the ministry. And there's 1,000 times more to preach there than there is here." I want to point out really quick, and it's too bad, I get it, he didn't have enough time to include this in the talk, but we've read this quote before. In fact, this is a quote that I have on my spreadsheet for visions and visitations. He talks about a really interesting story where you have Bishop Riskelly of Smithfield, Cache Valley, who became sick and he was on death's doorstep and he had a visitation from the other side of the veil. He was visited by President Peter Mon, I think that's how you pronounce it, who was dead. He came to him and said, "Brother Riskelly, we held a council on the other side of the veil. I have had a great deal to do, and I have the privilege of coming here to appoint one man to come and help. I've had 3 names given to me in council, and you are one of them. I want to inquire into your circumstances." The bishop told him what he had to do, and they conversed together as one man would converse with another. President Mon then said to him, "I think I will not call you. I think you are wanted here more than perhaps one of the others." And then you can pause and read it, but it goes on to say that the other became sick and then passed away. So when Wilford Woodruff and when Elder McConkie say, like, they're needed on the other side of the veil, and there may have been a council, like, they're being serious about that. And I wouldn't be surprised if we found that to be a very common thing. I did a video after the passing of my friend Troy with the Last Dispensation channel. He died young, and for all we know, maybe he was needed on the other side. Maybe they have some kind of YouTube in the spirit world, and he's now a podcaster over there. Probably not, but I wouldn't. Excuse me. I wouldn't be surprised if he is continuing his ministry over there. All right, continuing. When President Lee passed, he was attended by President Marion G. Romney, his second counselor, and President Spencer W. Kimball, the president of the Council of the 12. President N. Eldon Tanner was in Arizona at the time. Lucky guy. I love Arizona. Brother Romney, as the representative of and counselor to President Lee, was in complete and total charge at the hospital. He gave President Lee a blessing. He felt the spirit of peace and satisfaction, the calm assurance that whatever eventuated would be right. He did not promise President Lee that he would be healed. The president had become ill very rapidly, just in a matter of hours or moments. Shortly after this blessing, he passed away. At that moment, okay, now pay attention to this, because I don't know, I just think it's important. I feel like this is a powerful statement. At the moment he passed, Brother Romney, in harmony with the system and the established tradition and custom of the church, stepped aside, and President Spencer W. Kimball was then in complete charge and had total direction. President Kimball was at that moment the senior apostle of God on earth. And as the last heartbeat of President Lee ceased, the mantle of leadership passed to President Kimball, whose next heartbeat was that of a living oracle and presiding authority of God on earth. From that moment, the church continued under the direction of President Kimball. It's important to note, he's not saying that President Kimball suddenly became president of the church. Just simply that, remember, they all have keys. Every single one of the 15, they have all the keys. It's only the president of the church that can use all of them. But as far as authority goes, or like the highest position of the church, when this happens, there's no longer a first presidency for a period of time until it's reorganized. And the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, the apostle that has seniority, is now the one that's in charge, along with the Quorum of the 12. But he's the president. Okay, continuing. It was not required, nor was it requisite or needed, that the Lord give any revelation, that any special direction be given. The law was already ordained and established. God does not look down each morning and say, "The sun shall rise." He has already established the law. He has set the sun in the firmament, and the sun operates in harmony with established law in its rising. And so it was with the transfer of leadership from President Lee to President Kimball. When the president of the church passes on, the first presidency is disorganized, and the mantle of leadership, the reins of presidency, go to the senior man, left to the Council of the 12 as a body. In effect, the Council of the 12 becomes the first presidency of the church, and so continues unless and until a formal reorganization takes place. I'm going to skip this next paragraph, and then he says, now this right here is interesting. I just love getting little details like this. I highly doubt that I'm ever going to become an apostle. I think the vast majority of us, I know that the vast majority of us are not going to become apostles. We're not going to be able to be there and witness these things. So we have to rely on stories like this. But check this out and think about, the passing of President Nelson and then President Oaks becoming president of the church. Harmonious with that policy, that counsel, and that instruction, which has been followed in previous instances, the Council of the 12 met in the upper room of the Salt Lake Temple on Sunday, December 30th at 3 p.m. for the purpose of reorganizing the first presidency of the church. Normally, in that upper room, there are 3 chairs occupied by the first presidency and 12 chairs in a semicircle in front of them occupied by members of the Council of the 12. Now, luckily, I don't think luck had anything to do with it. I was blessed to be able to have access to the conference center for the purpose of doing a video tour, which I have posted on my other channel called Explore Church Sites. And I was there in September of 2025. And I guess this is where the miniature model of the Salt Lake Temple has been since they demolished the visitor centers on Temple Square. So I guess they moved it here. And I love these models. I wish they had one for every temple. I wish that you could purchase them, but I wouldn't have enough room in my house. I wouldn't even have room for one. I don't think. I could have it here in my studio, I guess, in the background. That'd actually be pretty cool. Um, so here you can see, here's the celestial room at the bottom right. This area right here. Here's the celestial room of the Salt Lake Temple. The top floor has the assembly hall. This is similar to the Kirtland Temple and Nauvoo Temple. Not all temples have assembly halls. They're the ones that have the 3 pulpits. In this case, there's 4, but it's basically, I mean, the Kirtland Temple does too, but there's like 3 prominent pulpits in the Kirtland Temple. And you have the same pattern here. On one side, it's for the Melchizedek priesthood. Actually, I think it's this side for the Melchizedek priesthood and for the other side for the Aaronic priesthood. Well, below that, you have this floor right here, and you can see the semicircle of chairs. So this is what he's referring to. There's this special room, and I want to say that there's a few other rooms here. I think there's like one for like the presidency of the 70. I did a video about it one time. I think there is. But just imagine this. Okay, here's the semicircle. So let's go back to the story. Normally, there are 3 chairs occupied by the first presidency and 12 chairs in a semicircle in front of them occupied by the members of the Council of the 12. On this occasion, however, there were 14 chairs in the semicircle because there were 14 brethren present who had been sustained and ordained and set apart as members of the Council of the 12. All right, so they actually changed the chairs while they had that meeting, which makes sense, but I don't know. I think that's neat. We took our places in those chairs, and President Kimball presided in the meeting, which lasted for 3.5 hours. Now, I don't know if he intended to do this, but I have this highlighted, the number 3.5 hours, because he repeats another 3.5 later. And 3.5 shows up in the scriptures. I have a, let's see, which one is it? I have this spreadsheet that we haven't really looked at for a while called Quotes Numbers, where I'm trying to find any quotes or any church publication that talks about the symbolism or significance of certain numbers. And I already had this 3.5 in terms of the phrase time and times and the dividing of time. I have these 2 quotes from President John Taylor. Well, I'm going to go ahead and add this. I'm just taking note of it that Bruce R. McConkie, I think he intentionally included this detail. So what is he talking about? So the meeting that they had to reorganize the first presidency, it took about 3.5 hours. I don't know if it was necessarily planned that way, but in the course of this meeting, President Kimball explained the business to be transacted, the things that might be done if the brethren felt so guided and led. He explained that when the prophet Joseph Smith was martyred, 3.5 years went by before President Young was formally chosen and installed as president of the church. To me, that's just it's a really interesting detail. 3.5 years. And one thing that I recently noticed in another video that I made, you know how President Nelson, he passed away on the 27th of September, and then President Holland passed away on the 27th of December. So they passed away exactly 3 months from each other. And right in the middle, that's when you had that aurora that was seen throughout the United States, exactly in the middle. Well, as I was doing this other video and I was looking at the different presidents of the church, I noticed that, Joseph Smith, he passed away on the 27th of June, and then President Brigham Young was ordained on December 27th. And then, of course, the Kirtland Temple was dedicated on the 27th of March. So I might have to add that to this spreadsheet that we're looking at. Anyway, 3.5, 27. I don't know. It's just interesting. He noted that almost that period, it's like 3.5 years, almost 3.5 years, went by between President Young and President John Taylor, and between President Taylor and President Wilford Woodruff. But that in each succeeding instance, the time had varied from 4 to 11 days. That's in, why are they taking, I mean, I guess just historians, they take note of dates and facts. So, but I don't know, he's pointing that out. And we were meeting on the 4th day after the passing of President Lee. He expressed himself as to what should be done, and he said that the proposition to be first considered was whether the first presidency should then be organized, or whether the church should continue to function with the Council of the 12 as its presiding officers. I should have highlighted that. I mean, it's interesting that that's even a question, don't you think? It's like, especially after the visitation of the Savior to Lorenzo Snow in the Salt Lake Temple, he appeared, I think, among other things, to instruct Lorenzo Snow to immediately reorganize the first presidency, to not delay. But I'd be curious to know what the circumstances would have to be for them to choose to delay reorganizing the first presidency. But I guess that's something that's brought up. I don't know if it's brought up every time, but it was here. Should then be reorganized, or whether the church should continue to function with the Council of the 12 as its presiding officers. And I guess later reorganize the first presidency. He then invited each member of the 12, commencing with Elder Ezra Taft Benson and continuing around the circle to me, to arise in turn and express himself frankly and fully and freely as to what ought to be done. I'll tell you what in thought, content, and substance was said by all the brethren on that occasion. But if I may, let me preface my statement by reading an account of what happened in the meeting of the Council of the 12 on the first occasion when they considered the problem of reorganizing the first presidency of the church. There have, of course, been 11 such meetings in this dispensation. These words I now read were spoken by Elder Orson Hyde of the Council of the 12, as he told of the first meeting. Remember, Orson Hyde, he's the one that was sent to the Holy Land and dedicated it for the return of the Jews. And today, on the Mount of Olives, you have the Orson Hyde Memorial Garden that's there. Okay, now this right here, I had no idea about this story. Maybe you did. I would love for you to tell me in the comments if you already knew about this story, because I feel like this is a not very well known story, but maybe that's just my perception. You can, if you want, I'm going to put the link for where you can find this. This is in Journal of Discourses, and I'll put the link for the full talk in the description box below. But he says, in the month of February 1848, the 12 apostles met at Hyde Park, Pottawatomie County, Iowa, where a small branch of the church was established. We were in prayer and council, communing together, and what took place on that occasion? The voice of God came from on high and spake to the council. Now, in case you think he's just saying like, oh yeah, we all felt the Spirit and we heard the voice of the Lord like intangibly. No, that's not what he's saying. And it's interesting because this was an important moment. Well, actually, I don't know the full story of like the timeline of what happened immediately after the martyrdom of Joseph Smith. But you remember that it was during that time that you got all these splinter groups. Like we had the RLDS Church, who waited for Joseph Smith's son, Joseph Smith III, to grow up so that he could be the next president of the church. We also had, where is it? On my other channel called Explore Church Sites, I, I've done a bunch of videos looking at these different splinter groups. You have Church of Christ Temple Lot right here. They're the ones that own the Temple Lot. You have Community of Christ, formerly known as the RLDS, and you have other splinter groups too. Many of them broken off of Community of Christ, like Remnant Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the Restoration branches and others. Well, it's interesting because I was looking into the history of Church of Christ Temple Lot, and they were headed by a man named Granville Hedrick. And initially, I can't remember which apostle it was, but there was an apostle that had obviously apostatized who thought that he told Granville Hedrick that he was going to be the next prophet after Joseph Smith. He ordained him prophet. But after a little while, Granville Hedrick decided that there shouldn't be a prophet, there shouldn't be a first presidency. It's only supposed to be the quorum and the 12. And that's how that church continued. And when you go to the visitor center, they will definitely let you know that if you let them know that you're a member of this church. And they're very nice people, but they like to try and debate that and convince you. But this is his gravesite here in Independence, Missouri. It's just over, if you're from this area, it's just over on Highway 24 in Salisbury Road. So here are the GPS coordinates, and then here's the street address in case you want to visit it. There's a little parking lot, but it's like a little family cemetery. This is the man that led the first former members of the church, the first Latter-day Saint movement, whatever you want to call it, the first splinter group back to Missouri. So that's why they got the Temple Lot. So, but what gets me is you have that one apostle. I don't know if he was here during this meeting, but if he was, then that's really bad. Because Orson Hyde said, "We were in prayer and council, communing together, and what took place on that occasion? The voice of God came from on high and spake to the council. Every latent feeling was aroused, and every heart melted. What did it say unto us? Quote, let my servant Brigham step forth and receive the full power of the presiding priesthood in my church and kingdom." End quote. This was the voice of the Almighty unto us at Council Bluffs before I removed to what was called Canesville. It has been said by some that Brigham was appointed by the people and not by the voice of God. I do not know that this testimony has often, if ever, been given to the masses of the people before, but I am one that was present. And there are others here that were also present on that occasion and did hear and feel the voice from heaven, and we were filled with the power of God. This is my testimony. These are my declarations unto the saints, unto the members of the kingdom of God in the last days, and to all people. Now look at this part. Okay, so if you're like, well, okay, but we're relying on what you said, and of course he's the one that's telling the story, but after that he says, men, women, and children came running together where we were and asked us what was the matter. They said that their houses shook and the ground trembled, and they did not know but that there was an earthquake. So this was not necessarily just the Spirit speaking to them, speaking to their hearts in a subtle way, where they were just like all in agreement. The way that he tells this story is that there was an actual voice that was heard, and people around that area thought that there was an earthquake that took place, and they ran over there to see if everything was okay. That's stunning to me. So I put this, where is it? I put it on my spreadsheet called Quotes, Visions, and Visitations. It's my newest. I'm going to classify it as a visitation because it doesn't seem like it was a vision. It seems like there was something there present with them, even if it was just a voice, like an audible voice. And then there were people outside that area that felt the shaking. So I'm going to classify it as a visitation. So this now makes a total of 103 that I have on my spreadsheet. Accounts of visions, visitations, near-death experiences, etc. And for the 1940s, this is my ninth. So the 1940s are in third place so far in terms of the total number of visions and visitations. Of course, I'm not going to be able to capture them all. I'll only try and get the ones that are documented. And even then, it's going to be difficult to track them all down. All right, but continuing, we told them that there was nothing the matter, not to be alarmed. The Lord was only whispering to us a little, in that he was probably not very far off. We felt no shaking of the earth or of the house, but were filled with the exceeding power and goodness of God. We knew and realized that we had the testimony of God within us. On the 6th day of April following at our annual conference, I might say that on the coming 6th day of April at our annual conference, we'll do precisely what they did here. That's Bruce R. McConkie talking. Held in the log tabernacle at Canesville, the propriety of choosing a man to preside over the church was investigated. In a very few minutes, it was agreed to, and Brigham Young was chosen to fill that place without a dissenting voice. The people not knowing that there had been any revelation touching the matter. They ignorantly seconded the voice of the Lord from on high in his appointment. Yes, the voice of God was the voice of the people. Brigham went right ahead silently to do the work of the Lord and to feed his sheep and take care of them like a faithful shepherd, leaving all vain aspirants to quarrel and contend about lineal descent, right, power, and authority. And so these are the splinter groups that he's referring to that went on to become these different churches. That is what transpired the first time the Council of the 12 met to reorganize the first presidency of the church. And in essence, thought content, and certainly in spirit, precisely the same thing occurred on the 13th day of December last. Each member of the council, in turn, specifically and pointedly expressed himself to the effect that now was the time to reorganize the first presidency of the church, that there should be no further delay, that the effective and proper operation of this great organization that we have from the Lord needed this administrative arrangement. Each one in turn expressed himself that President Spencer W. Kimball was the man whom the Lord wanted to preside over the church. There was no question whatever about that. Really quick, I just want to point out, I think there's a couple apostles recently who have said, that they were a witness to the mantle falling on President Oaks, in that it was a very sacred experience, and without giving much detail as to why that was, other than just the obvious, of course, it's a special experience. But I feel like this might be some of it. Like, could you imagine being there and hearing each apostle testify, bear their testimony, express their opinion, their view, and everybody being unanimous in just the spirit that's felt? And potentially, I mean, as far as I know, we don't have any other records like the one from Orson Hyde, but maybe each time or maybe occasionally the voice of the Lord is literally heard. Maybe he makes an appearance sometimes. I don't know. But I think it's really special. There was total and complete unity and harmony. The prayer that was in the heart of every person present was, Lord, show unto thy servants whom thou hast chosen to be president of the church. We did not want to do anything other than what the Lord wanted done. President Young is quoted as having said, following the death of the prophet, I don't care who presides in the church. All I want to know is what the Lord thinks about it. The Lord made manifest his will in that day, and that's what we wanted to know for our day. And when we met for this most recent reorganization, the Lord made manifest his will to us. It was as though the voice of God had said to each one of us individually and to all of us collectively, let my servant Spencer step forth and receive the full power in the presiding priesthood in my church and kingdom. I'm actually going to skip this next part. You can pause and read this if you want to. Read these 3 paragraphs. I want to read this next one. Now, President Lee has passed away. He was a great spiritual giant, a prince in Israel, someone to whom we looked with unbounded admiration. And then what he says here, I think, is interesting. It's about Harold B. Lee. I've added it to a new entry on my spreadsheet called Quotes A through Z. The new row 361 for Lee Harold B. Okay, about him, Elder Bruce R. McConkie says, few men have lived in our day who have had more direct contact with the Lord, who have felt the spirit of inspiration, and who have been able to convey the mind and will of the Lord to his people as well as President Lee has done. I think that's an interesting statement. And I'd like to know if he's like, when he says direct contact, I'm wondering if he really, really means that. Direct contact with the Lord. We had supposed, not knowing the providences of the Lord, that President Lee would be with us for a long time. But there are 2 things we should note in his call to go elsewhere. One is that the Lord has another work for him to do, and it is a greater and more extensive work than what he was presently assigned to do. The Lord, in his infinite wisdom and goodness, knows what ought to be done with his servants. The other thing to note is that when the Lord calls a new prophet, now think about this as we're thinking about President Oaks. The other thing to note is that when the Lord calls a new prophet, he does it because he has a work and a labor and a mission for the new man to perform. So we just had President Nelson, and President Nelson did a lot of things. And now the Lord has a work and a labor and a mission for the new man to perform. And of course, we've talked about this before. It's interesting that he has a legal background, and he called President Christopherson, who also has a legal background. We've talked about the fact that he called Elder Casse, who had been the presiding bishop of the church and involved in church finances, because maybe it's going to be useful in the days ahead to have somebody with that experience as an apostle. And then also Elder Clark G. Gilbert, who had been president of BYU, and he was part of the crackdown around 2021 when President Holland had gone to BYU for their commencement address, or the beginning of their school year. And they told the faculty and staff that things needed to change, that they needed to be in line with the mission of the church and the doctrine of the church. And then Elder Gilbert, he essentially enforced that. And so there were a number of people that were upset when he was called. So when we think about President Oaks in his presidency and the background of him, President Christopherson, Elder Casse, Elder Gilbert, and maybe others that I'm not thinking about, maybe we're going to see some of that put into action in this new period of time. Now look at this. He continues. I can suppose that when the prophet Joseph Smith was taken from this life, the saints felt themselves in the depths of despair. To think that a leader of such spiritual magnitude had been taken from them. Our Revelation says, Joseph Smith, the prophet and seer of the Lord, has done more, save Jesus only, for the salvation of men in this world, than any other man that ever lived in it. From Doctrine and Covenants 135, verse 3. We do not have language or capacity or ability to extol the greatness and the glory of the ministry and mission of the prophet Joseph Smith. And yet, when he was taken, the Lord had Brigham Young. Brigham Young stepped forth and wore the mantle of leadership. Now pay attention to this, again, as we think about President Oaks. With all respect and admiration and every accolade of praise resting upon the prophet Joseph Smith and right now we could say the prophet Russell M. Nelson, still Brigham Young and President Oaks came forward and did things that then had to be done in a better way than the prophet Joseph himself could have done them. This is interesting. This is something that I think people don't fully grasp sometimes. Sometimes people get perturbed by a new prophet who changes things or he focuses on different areas. They think that the prophet, from prophet to prophet, the president of the church is supposed to be just one big monolithic, homogeneous, static thing that doesn't change ever, 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 ever. But the way that I think about it is this: when you're building a temple, you don't just use one tool. Sometimes you use a saw. Sometimes you use a welding machine. Sometimes you use a hammer, screwdriver. You have to have all the different tools. Each one has a function, and they're all needed to build a structure. And so I think that accounts for the differences that you see from one prophet to another, from one stake president to another, from one bishop to another, and any other position in the church. All right, continuing. Now, no one can say too emphatically or too strongly or praise too highly the leadership of President Lee, but this is a forward-looking church. We do not look backward. We do not do other than go forward and onward. Our destiny is to proclaim the everlasting gospel into every ear. This church will roll on until the knowledge of God covers the earth as the waters cover the sea. And so we look to the future. We now look to a new prophet who will wear the mantle of leadership and who will, with dignity and honor and inspiration and with the guidance of heaven, do things that are appointed for his time and his season that no one else could have done. That's going to be the thumbnail. Do things that are appointed for his time and his season that no one else could have done. Well, actually, that might be the title. That's kind of long. The things that no one else could have done. We're looking at President Oaks right now. He said that the mantle is very heavy. I don't know if that's just because it would feel that way anyways, or maybe he has some idea of what's down the road. You know, all 15 men are prophets, right? Only the president of the church receives prophecy for the whole church, but they have special access to things that have to do with the church. I wouldn't be surprised if through meetings that they've had, as well as revelation that he's received about the future of the church and his role, if he knows that the path ahead is difficult and that no one else can do what he's about to do. I think that's the case. All right, let's finish this up. The Lord's hand is in the work, and Spencer Kimball is the prophet of God, the mouthpiece of the Almighty for the time and the season that are appointed ahead. God grant that it may be extensive and long, and that we may continue to get the inspiration and guidance that come through his newly appointed servant. Here's another quote. I'm not going to read it. It's from Wilford Woodruff, but it's his telling what Joseph Smith said to the Quorum of the 12 shortly before he died, that he was rolling the kingdom off on their shoulders and they have all the keys of the kingdom of God. And there was a part where he said he didn't expect to see the temple completed, referring to the Nauvoo temple, and the apostles were confused why he was saying that. And then there's just one more thing I wanted to read at the bottom. It says, the destiny of the church is guaranteed and assured. So in other words, there's not going to be a general apostasy. There's always these little guys that pop up from time to time, sometimes on YouTube, sometimes other places, where they want to make it seem as though there's going to be an apostasy and there's going to be this mysterious prophetic figure that comes that's going to correct the church, and oh, surprise, it's them. Or they start a splinter group and they essentially form a cult. Don't listen to those voices. Please don't listen to them. Elder Bruce R. McConkie says, the destiny of the church is guaranteed and assured. The only problem that ever can arise is with individuals. Whether individuals will walk in the light and do the things that they must do to be in harmony with the church and to reap and inherit its blessings. I've added this quote to my spreadsheet called Quotes A through Z, row 40 for apostasy church-wide. So we have this one from Elder Bruce R. McConkie, and then this from President Gordon B. Hinckley. He said, I give you my solemn testimony that this church will never be led astray. It is in the hands of God, and should any of its leaders ever attempt to lead it astray, he is the power to remove them. He has said that he has restored his work for the last time, never again to be destroyed nor given to other people. So I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. There was a lot of good stuff in this talk. And again, just remember, if you're interested in learning more about Judaism with me, subscribe to Jewish Scroll. The link is in the description box below. And if you're interested in church sites that are here in Missouri and Nauvoo, in Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, I have my other channel called Explore Church Sites. It's been a little while since I've made a video, but I have 2 new ones I'm going to post pretty soon. And I'm probably going to make more videos this spring and summer. But anyway, that's going to be it for this one. I'll talk to you guys later.